So what are mergers and acquisitions? Today, presentation will cover the essentials for mergers and acquisitions and how these events impact the CDFI certification. We'll start by establishing what mergers and acquisitions are. Then we'll cover how they impact the CDFI certification. Next, we'll walk through the things to keep in mind when submitting a CDFI certification application if your entity is impacted by a merger or an acquisition. We'll also provide important details about the material events, mergers and acquisition requirements to report within the certification agreement. And last, we'll cover key contact information on who to reach and how to contact the CDFI Fund if you have any questions. And we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So what are mergers and acquisitions? A merger, an occasion when two or more organizations join together to make one larger organization. Acquisition, when one organization takes another organization under its control. This is how the CDFI certification team defines both of these terms. You might be familiar with another definition. While often these terms are interchangeable, mergers and acquisitions aren't exactly the same. A merger represents that situation where there's two organizations coming together, and then that acquisition is when an organization is taking another organization under its control. And when we talk about control, we have a definition within our regulations of what we consider a controlling relationship is. And that's going to be in an upcoming FAQ document that we're about to release. So if you have any questions about that, please submit a service request, and you can go back to our interim regulation or wait for that FAQ update because that's coming down the pike. So here's an example. In short, a merger is when two existing companies, in this case, Org1 and Org2, combine into a singular new entity. An acquisition is when we have two separate companies and coming together within the same, one organization is acquiring another so that they're in the same family of organizations. Now we're going to talk about how mergers and acquisitions impact the CDFI certification. It all relates to which entity is the primary holder of an EIN. The CDFI certification can only be conferred on an entity that is the primary holder of a federal employer identification number. If an entity does not have an EIN, or it is not the primary holder of that EIN, it must obtain or maintain its status as the primary holder of its own EIN in order to maintain the CDFI certification. An entity may not seek or maintain the CDFI certification on behalf of another entity, e.g. a subsidiary, a parent entity, a yet-to-be-established entity. The CDFI certification is linked to the primary EIN in connection with which it was approved or it will be approved. So this is a reminder, the CDFI certification is linked to whatever entity is the primary holder of that EIN. An entity may not seek or maintain the CDFI certification on behalf of that other entity. The EIN cannot be extended, the certification cannot be extended to cover any entity besides the primary holder. So it can't be extended to cover entities that might share that relevant EIN but are disregarded for federal tax purposes, or affiliates of the entity that holds that EIN. It can't be transferred to another entity with a different EIN as well. This relates to the connection to mergers and acquisitions, that transferring concept or the coverage of one entity having the certification and covering its affiliates. So mergers, a surviving entity following a merger event must be the primary holder of an EIN for certification purposes. So let's break this down into an example. Say we have, prior to the merger, Organization 1 and Organization 2, and the EIN for Organization 1 is 123. EIN for Org 2 is 456. Obviously, those of you are probably familiar with this. If you're on this call, EINs are not just three numbers, but that's just for the example. Post-merger, let's say both of these entities have combined and the merged organization is holding one of these entities' EIN. Let's say it takes Org 1's EIN. So now the surviving entity post-merger now has an EIN of 123. How this might relate to an organization certification is if an entity, say we have Org 1 is a certified CDFI, and the surviving entity holds the same as the primary holder of Org 1's EIN, then after a material events review, that certification can still be in existence despite, a name change or anything that, it still needs to go under a material events review, but that certification, since it is tied to that original EIN of 123, that can still remain in place. Now, if another situation happened where Org 2 was the certified CDFI, and if post-merger, the surviving entity was the primary holder of Org 1's original EIN, then the certification will have to be terminated because the surviving entity will not be the primary holder of the organization that was connected to the CDFI certification. So it's important to know that the surviving entity following a merger must be the primary holder of an EIN for certification purposes. Now let's talk about acquisitions. Acquired entities may impact the affiliate relevant to a certified CDFI, the affiliates relevant to a certified CDFI or a CDFI applicant. And let's look at an example here. So say we have Org 1 and Org 2, and they're separate organizations, but Org 1 acquires Org 2. That CDFI, if one of these groups had a CDFI certification, we already know that the CDFI certification cannot be transferred or spread to cover both organizations within the family of entities. So if Organization 1 had the CDFI certification and it acquired Organization 2, then Organization 1 may still be a certified CDFI. However, and we would still have to, that group would have to still report this as a material event. We would still have to review it. The CDFI would still have to make a determination of the material event review, but potentially that Organization 1 could still be a certified CDFI. But that won't allow the acquired Org 2 to also become a CDFI unless it applies. If Org 2 is the entity that originally has the CDFI certification and it's acquired by Org 1, Org 1 will always be relevant to Org 2 CDFI certification, given that it's the parent affiliate or it has that controlling relationship over acquired Org 2. However, Org 2's CDFI certification cannot be transferred or extended to cover Org 1 unless Org 1 applies on its own to be a certified CDFI. So now let's cover how mergers and acquisitions may impact how an entity prepares for the CDFI certification. Here is the time frame under review or under consideration for mergers as it relates to preparing for a CDFI certification. We have the most recently completed fiscal year for entities that are non-banks and they're not regulated by federal banking regulators. They need to report information relating to their staff time as it's predominantly used for financing activity, as well as they need to provide a financial statement for their most recently completed fiscal year. That's also the most recently completed fiscal year is also the time frame that we are looking at financial product activity as it's directed to a target market. We also have the current fiscal year to date as of the application's submission date. That current fiscal year, that's relevant for non-regulated institutions. It's relevant for their assets, so that we can look at which assets are directed towards financing activity to ensure that there is a predominance of assets directed towards financing activity, as well as does the board that's currently in place have accountability to the proposed target markets. The last time period under review, as you can see in the purple circle, that's the CDFI fund review period. That's when we're reviewing the application and we have not made a determination. So I've identified these 3 windows of time that are relevant to the application process, and they are also relevant to whether or not a merger occurs. So you're going to see this icon throughout the next couple of slides, and I'm going to try to, you'll see it cover, if you'll see a square, it'll cover which period I'm talking about. So we're going to talk about the most recently completed fiscal year first, and that's why you can see in the bottom, we're covering it with that icon. So the first aspect that is relevant to if a merger, the first aspect of the certification requirements that mergers are relevant towards are the primary mission requirements. If a merger occurs, an applicant needs to ensure that the primary mission of the surviving entity, which is the primary holder of that EIN, has been the promotion of community development for at least 6 months. If the acquired organization's financing activity is being presented as the surviving entity's financing activity in their TLR, then the new then the merger is relevant because when responding to the responsible financing practices questions in the primary mission section of the application, that surviving entity needs to ensure that the acquired entity's financial products are all in alignment with the responsible financing practices that they're attesting to. The next section is the financing entity requirements. The applicant needs to provide if the applicant is not regulated by a federal financing institution or a federal banking institution, I'm sorry. They need to provide a financial statement that reflects the financial position of their surviving entity for the most recently completed fiscal year. And that surviving entity, just as a reminder, needs to be the primary holder of that EIN. The next aspect is the full-time equivalent staff time. So if we have an entity that needs to present its staff time as predominant to financing activity, then that calculation is being done examining the staff time, the average full-time equivalent staff time over that entity's most recently completed fiscal year. So if the merger is occurring during the most recently completed fiscal year, looking at the full surviving entity's most recently completed fiscal year, the entity would need to take into consideration the average of all full-time equivalent staff throughout that year. The next is the target market requirements. So if a merger occurs in the most recently completed fiscal year, the financing activity of an acquired entity may count towards the target market requirements of the acquiring entity only if that activity is included in the non-consolidated financial statements of the acquiring entity at the end of the acquiring entity's fiscal year. So if a merger takes place, at the end of the surviving entity, the surviving entity might present the activity of the acquired entity from that most recently completed fiscal year only if the assets related to the financing activity of the acquired entities presented in the non-consolidated version of their financial statements at the end of the fiscal year. If the merger occurs for an affiliate that is relevant to an applicant's collective review process, that standard remains the same. When we are publishing these slides, here's a summary of all of the requirements that are affected by mergers that occurred during an applicant's most recently completed fiscal year. Next, let's talk about mergers in the current fiscal year to date. So starting with primary mission, when a merger occurs in an applicant's current fiscal year with respect to the certification application submission, it must still demonstrate that the surviving entity has had a governing leadership approved primary mission of community development in place for at least 6 months. Even if there has been a name change of the surviving organization, the applicant must provide evidence to substantiate that name change and that the community development mission has been in place for the primary holder of the EIN across those 6 months. The next is the financing entity requirements. The assets presented in the application must be of the surviving entity that is the primary holder of the EIN. Also, as a reminder, the current fiscal year financial statements must be of the current fiscal year and as of no more than 45 days prior to the application submission. So essentially, if my entity started its fiscal year on January 1st, today is March 6th. So if I submitted my application today, it would have to be the current fiscal year financial statements would need to be as of some point, either from today to 45 days prior to today. So long as they reflect a position as of 45, at least for no more than 45 days prior to that, then that will meet our requirements. The next is accountability. The surviving entity must provide accountability to its proposed target market components via its governing and/or advisory boards. Here is a summary page of all the requirements that are impacted when a merger occurs in an applicant's current fiscal year to date. When a merger occurs post when the application is submitted, but before the CDFI fund renders its determination, you'll need to report that event to the CDFI fund. Applicants that merge with other entities, or for applicants subject to the collective review process, have a relevant affiliate to its collective review process that merges with another entity after the CDFI certification has been submitted, but before the review has been completed, we must report this to the CDFI fund. Applications from such applicants cannot be approved regardless of whether the applicant is a surviving entity. Your entity will then need to submit a new application once the merger is finalized. Next, we're going to go over the time frame that would be of the application that could potentially be impacted from an acquisition event. It's the same timeline from the mergers where we have the most recently completed fiscal year of an applicant, the current fiscal year to date, as of when the applicant submits the application, and the CDFI fund review period, but before the CDFI fund has rendered its determination. So when acquisitions occur in the most recently completed fiscal year or in the current fiscal year to date, they potentially could impact an entity's primary mission. And this could bring up forth a new affiliate that would be relevant to the CDFI certification's primary mission requirements. If the entity is not subject to the collective review, this affiliate could potentially be a parent or controlling affiliate, or it could be an affiliate that engages in financing activity. If the acquired affiliate meets one of those standards, then we are looking for their mission and their responsible financing practices requirements for each of those covered affiliates. If the entity is subject to the collective review, then it would need to meet the collective review requirements for relevant affiliates to the collective review. When an acquisition occurs either in the most recently completed fiscal year or during the current fiscal year to date, it might impact an entity's target market collective review requirements. If an entity is subject to the collective review, the applicant must dedicate at least 60% of its individual financing activity to its target market, as well as at least 60% of the combined financing activity of the applicant and its affiliates to their collective certification market. Affiliates don't need to individually meet the 60% threshold for target market activity, but in aggregate, they must all meet the the target market financial product activity benchmarks. The next relevant requirements affect the accountability collective review requirements when an acquisition occurs in the most recently completed fiscal year or during the current fiscal year to date. An applicant, when subject to the collective review, must demonstrate accountability both individually to its own CDFI certification target market based on its own accountability methods, and collectively, where each relevant affiliate must also demonstrate accountability to its collective review markets via its own accountability method. So any organization that has become an applicant's affiliate via an acquisition during the relevant most recently completed fiscal year or current fiscal year period, that organization would need to meet the accountability requirements. Here is a summary of all of those relevant requirements when an acquisition occurs during that review period. when an acquisition occurs post-application submission, but before the CDFI fund has made a determination on your applications, that event must be reported to the CDFI fund. CDFI certifications from such applicants cannot be approved regardless of whether or not the applicant is still the surviving entity post-merger, or post-acquisition. It could be the parent entity or something. But if that particular acquisition occurs in that period, notify the CDFI fund, and then after the acquisition has been finalized, you may reapply for the certification. In this section of the presentation, let's review the mergers and acquisitions material event reporting requirements. So this would happen after an organization is certified as a CDFI and it signs the certification agreement. So let's cover this element of the certification agreement. We have our certification agreement here. This is what all CDFIs will sign once they are determined to be certified by the CDFI fund, and the CDFI fund will countersign. In Article 5, Section 1, we outline certain circumstances where certified CDFIs must report material events. In Article 5, Section 1, we also outline the instructions for how a certified CDFI must report to the CDFI fund when a material event occurs. If your entity is signing this certification agreement, you'll become familiar with this section of the agreement. The important thing to note here is item 9. It's section 1C, item 9. Mergers and acquisitions are occasions for material event reporting. Once the CDFI reports the material event, CDFI fund staff will review the details against the aspects of the CDFI certification requirements that I had referenced in the previous section, and we will render a determination on how the material event will affect your entity's CDFI certification. Well, now this brings us to the last section of this presentation. For questions about the CDFI certification, contact the CDFI Fund's Office of Certification Policy and Evaluation via AMIS service request. And for questions about the ACR or TLR, contact the CDFI Fund's Office of Financial Strategies and Research, FS&R, via the email address that's featured on the screen, or by AMIS service request. We also include detailed guidance on our public website, and it can be found at the link, but please check regularly. We're updating FAQs, supplemental guidance, and other relevant material on that particular web page. On March 20th, we are having another CDFI certification webinar about the opposite topic, spinoff provisions. So opposite from a merger or an acquisition, we have a spinoff. So that's what we're going to be covering the next CDFI certification webinar. We also have scheduled webinars in April and in May, but we have not announced our topics yet. So stay tuned for that, but we will still be holding a webinar in some capacity on those dates. Thank you so much for participating. This concludes the presentation aspect of this webinar, but we still will take questions. So thank you all so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And the way that we handle questions are we allow questioners or callers in to raise their hand, and we will we'll sort through raised hand questions And when we have a lull and folks asking questions by raising their hand, we would then will start taking the Q&A written form of the question. So I'll allow everybody a couple moments to start queuing up. I see we have Donovan Jacobs with a question.
Hi, you can hear me?
Yeah, hey,
Great.
welcome to the
Great.
CD5 Funds webinar. Thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
calling in.
Thank you. This may be a question you can't answer because it seems like you're really focused on certification specifically. I'm working with two entities which may be merging.
Okay.
They haven't applied yet for certification. They just received their CDFI TA awards. Would those awards be affected by a merger or an acquisition?
Potentially. What I would recommend, so um, one of the compliance requirements for the TA award is to eventually apply for CDFI certification. So
Right.
depending on when the surviving entity of this potential merger applies, some of the content that I like had gone over might be relevant to your
Mhm.
organization, and I hope that was helpful. As it relates to specifically the two TA awards, you'll have to contact each of the organization's portfolio management officer at the CDFI fund, and they will give you direct information
Okay.
on how to go about dealing with the compliance of that type of
Okay.
event.
So the portfolio manager officers for the two entities.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That is very helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Yeah, and you can just contact them via service request, or if you have one of their contacts information.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
So seeing no hands up at the moment. So I see somebody's asking, please send me the link for this meeting for credit unions. Um, Perhaps you can raise your hand and we can provide a little bit more context there. I think I don't totally understand what you're asking. Hey,
I heard you talking about the credit union about in the
oh, oopsie. That was a technical issue. I'm so sorry. Demetra, are you back? You can come off mute. Sorry about
okay.
that.
I'm here.
Could you ask that question again?
I was just commenting on what they had in the chat. You said that there was a technical error
Oh yeah.
in the
We couldn't
chat.
we couldn't hear your question.
Oh, in the questions, y'all were talking about the credit union industry, the conference for this week with the director.
Oh, yeah, we're probably not able to totally speak on that's kind of out of the purview of like what we're aware of at this time. And
Okay, I was just wondering when it was. I just wanted a link so I can see it. That's
yeah,
all.
I I would see if you're connected to any industry trade groups, I would probably just try to contact them for that link.
Oh,
But
okay. Okay.
yeah,
All
thanks
right.
for asking.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questioners at the moment? I don't see anyone at this moment asking another question.
Mitchell, we have a hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Dr. Farmer? Hey there.
Hi.
How's it
Yes,
going?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Thanks for
Thank you
asking.
so much for hosting this. I had a little bit of a fried brain, and so there's just a tad bit of confusion behind. I would like you, please, if you would, to reiterate the TLR that the entity would submit because okay, so if the merger or acquisition is complete and happened in last year,
Uh-huh.
the closed out fiscal year,
Sure.
then you said to use the loans that are of the surviving entity or on a consolidated statement. I missed it. So if you would
Oh yeah, no
reiterate
worries.
what the TLR should be if it happens in their last fiscal year or in their current year right now.
That sounds great. So,
Thank you.
yeah, no worries. And hopefully I was clear enough the first time. I might have actually not have had made the most sense. So thanks for allowing me to explain it again.
It could
But
be my brain, Mitchell. I wouldn't
um,
blame you at all.
um, well, thank you. But basically, so the financing activity of an acquired entity may count to the target market requirements of the acquiring entity, so the surviving entity, if that activity is included in the non-consolidated financial statements. So say we have a surviving entity. We have the merger, it took place in 2024. Let's say we have an entity that has a fiscal year end date of December 31st, 2024. So fiscal year 2024. That's when the merger happened. So long that the assets derived from the financing activity of the acquired entity, so the entity that's no longer in existence, are featured on the non-consolidated financial statements of their surviving entity. That surviving entity may use the acquired entity's activity for the target market reporting requirements. And that's how it's related to the TLR is in order to see if your entity is meeting the target market requirements, you're reporting that information in the TLR. So so say the merger happened, the originations of that acquired entity, they may be included in the surviving entity's TLR, even though the surviving entity was not the financing entity of record when those originations occurred. But so long that the assets derived from those financial products are in the surviving entity's balance sheet at the end of that period, then you may use those in your target market activity. But I say may, it's not a requirement to use those at this time, but your entity may use those.
Thank you very much, Mitchell.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Thanks for asking the question, and thanks for allowing me to present it in a different example. Maybe I should have provided a like a graphic too. I'm thinking of that when I was preparing the slides. Maybe I can update that for what goes on our website. So thanks for asking. So we have a question from Katrina. I'm going to pull Katrina in to speak.
Hi, Mitchell. Can you hear me?
Hi. How's it going?
Good, good. You?
Yeah, doing fine. Thanks for asking.
Good. Yes, I have a question. If a CDFI did a recent merger, let's just say from fiscal year 2024,
Uh-huh.
But this merger now is taking out their eligibility to pass the predominance test via its assets.
Uh-huh.
How can they is there any way if they can resolve this? Because prior, they would have been able to meet this predominance test, but now they're not able to, as it relates back to their assets due to the merger. Is there anything that you guys can advise on how can they still qualify for recertification purposes
Yeah.
if they're not meeting the predominance test for their assets?
So the top line answer would be the entity needs to meet the predominance requirements. But remember, predominance doesn't need to mean 50% or 51%. It's predominant. So that means when you take portions of all of the activity that the entity is engaged in, whatever the highest amount of assets are devoted to a certain activity, that would be the predominant activity. So if financing is the predominant, you know, I've seen a case once before where financing entity requirements were met with assets devoted to 26% of the overall activity. But technically, when they broke it down and they showed evidence of this on their balance sheet, that you know, the other subsequent activities were smaller in asset size. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the bright line, top line, I guess, would be that same predominance requirement. Now, if your entity, or if this hypothetical entity, however you're connected to it, this situation, there is something called the spinoff entity provision that it seems that the CDFI fund has definitely allowed entities to use, and entities in cases such as these sometimes will use, where basically if you meet certain requirements for the spinoff entity provision, you're allowed to separate the one and the larger entity and break it off into a smaller entity within a family of entities. So you'll have a parent affiliate that's transferring its financial product activity and the assets related to the financial product activity to a spun off entity. And that entity that spun off is now the entity that is engaging in the financial product activity, and it's offering at least one of the same financial products that the parent entity used to offer. So I would look into that requirement. That might be relevant. And we do allow that under the revised certification policies.
That's helpful. Thank you, Mitchell.
Yeah, I'm happy that was helpful. And there was an anonymous attendee that asked a very similar question to this in our Q&A. And I'm just going to answer that kind of just to piggyback off of Katrina. So the anonymous attendee asked, for CDFIs that are not meeting the predominance test in staff or in assets, for the purposes of their recertification, can they transfer their assets to their affiliate entity? Does this count as a merger? No, it would not count as a merger. Mergers are specifically two entities coming together as one, where there'll be like a surviving entity. However, depending on the circumstances, it might count as a spinoff entity. I would look into that spinoff entity. I would look into the spinoff entity requirements, and we're going to be presenting on this next webinar, so that's something to keep in mind. But before that, our requirements for the spinoff entity provision are outlined in our CDFI certification supplemental guidance. And maybe this is a good time to, as I see there's a little bit of a lull in questions, maybe this is a good time to show how to access this information from our website. So I'm going to pull it up on my screen. And I'm not sharing yet, but I will be sharing in a second. Okay. Are we seeing what's on my screen? I think so. So let me expand the page. Okay, so if you go to our public website, under the tab Programs and Training, you have certification. You can go to CDFI certification. And if you scroll down, after these general overview headers, we have how to apply. Step 1, we have webinars. So this is where you guys probably access to come to the monthly webinar. Underneath, eventually we will be providing the recorded versions of the webinars that we just completed. But underneath, we have pre-recorded versions of the steps that walk through how to create the various records, how to complete the CDFI certification application template, and what the roadmap is for applying for a certification, all the components of certification application, and there are recorded webinars for each of these. There's archived webinars, so that has good content there. If you go to the next page, step 2, apply, we learn about the application process. And if you scroll down a little bit further, and this is all important information too, but I'm just trying to get to this, we have application materials. So we have our most recently updated FAQ document as of November 1st, 2024. We have our pre-approved target market assessment methodologies. We have our Bible for applying for certification, the CDFI certification supplemental guidance and tips document, and that's going to be a very influential guide to applying. So it'll be the document that looks like this, where there's a little child in art class at the top. And what we do here, it's very long, but we try to provide very thorough information about each aspect of certification. And part of the reasons why it's long is, as you can see, I'm kind of scrolling fast to kind of give you an example, but we have the data fields of the application and then provide supplemental guidance related to how to complete each of those data fields. So a helpful resource, I hope. But those are important resources for how to click submit. Great. So I'm just seeing a lull in questions as we're nearing the 4 o'clock hour Eastern time. Here's your last opportunity to hop in here and ask a question. Okay, seeing no questions at the time. And if you need to pop in and ask one, here's your chance. But seeing no questions, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and bringing your questions forward. If you have any follow-up questions, or if you have any questions about a topic that we're not covering today, we encourage you to submit them to the CDFI Fund via service request. And that's in the CDFI Fund's online AMIS portal. If you don't have an AMIS account, you can send us an email. Our email is featured on our public website. The guidance materials, as I showed, are available on our CDFI Fund's public website, and we hold these CDFI certification conferences every other week. So please join us again. Our next call is on March 20th. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks so much for joining.